Andrew Montgomery stared out the window of his 38th floor office, his sharp, calculating eyes scanning the sprawling cityscape of New York below. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the towering buildings, and in the distance, the first lights of the city began to flicker. His office, pristine and modern, reflected the very essence of the man who owned it, immaculate, controlled, and cold. Andrew was the CEO of one of the largest investment firms on Wall Street, a man whose name was synonymous with power and wealth. To the outside world, he had everything: a lavish penthouse, private jets, and access to the upper echelons of society. But those who worked closest to him knew the truth. Andrew was a man devoid of warmth, distant from his family, and entirely consumed by his corporate empire. Every decision he made was measured and pragmatic, leaving no room for emotions or sentimentality. As he turned away from the window, his reflection in the glass caught his eye. His face, though handsome, was stern and impassive, with faint lines that hinted at the weight of his past. Andrew had long since buried the man he used to be, the young boy who once believed in family, love, and connection. Now, all that remained was his relentless drive for success. He had severed ties with his past long ago, leaving a trail of broken relationships behind him, most notably with his own family. The Montgomerys had once been close-knit, but Andrew's ambition had torn them apart. Behind him, the sound of a door opening broke his thoughts. His assistant, Vanessa, stepped in cautiously. "Mr. Montgomery, your car is ready," she said, her tone professional yet subdued, as though she feared breaking the delicate silence that always lingered around him. "Cancel it," Andrew replied abruptly. "I'll walk." Vanessa blinked, taken aback. Andrew never walked, but she knew better than to question him and nodded before quietly stepping out. Andrew straightened his suit jacket, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle, and left his office without another word. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, each floor ticking by as he descended into the heart of the city. When he stepped out onto the bustling streets, he was greeted by the cool evening air and the chaotic hum of New York life. People hurried past him, absorbed in their own worlds, oblivious to the man who walked among them. He walked without direction, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. For the first time in what felt like years, Andrew allowed his mind to wander. He thought of his father, a hard man who had molded him into the ruthless businessman he had become, and his sister, Sarah, who had once been his closest confidant before he had pushed her away in favor of ambition. He hadn't spoken to her in years, not since the scandal that had destroyed her and left an unspoken wound in their family. Lost in thought, Andrew turned down a side street, one far removed from the glamour of Wall Street. The air grew colder, the lights dimmer, and the sounds quieter. As he passed a narrow alley, something caught his eye. A figure huddled against the side of a building, shivering in the shadows. It was a young woman, dirty and frail, with matted hair and clothes that barely clung to her thin frame. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide and hollow, like someone who had seen too much pain for someone her age. Andrew's instinct was to keep walking. He had passed countless homeless people before without so much as a second glance. It was part of the city, a backdrop to his life of wealth and privilege. Yet something about this woman made him stop. There was a strange pull, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, though he couldn't place it. "Spare some change?" she asked, her voice rough and hesitant, as though she had given up on expecting kindness from the world. Andrew stood there for a moment, his mind at war with itself. He could easily walk away, pretend he hadn't seen her, and return to his comfortable, controlled life. But for the first time in years, something inside him stirred, a distant, long-buried feeling he couldn't quite name. "Wait here," he said quietly, pulling out his phone. "I'll get you something to eat." The woman looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to respond, let alone offer help. Andrew wasn't sure why he was doing this. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else entirely. But as he walked toward the nearby deli, a strange sense of unease settled over him. There was something disturbingly familiar about the woman's face, something that gnawed at the edges of his memory. And for the first time in years, Andrew Montgomery felt something other than cold calculation. He felt uncertainty. Andrew returned to the alley, carrying a warm sandwich and a bottle of water, unsure of why he was even doing this. It was entirely unlike him to deviate from his routine, much less engage with a stranger on the street. But something about this woman felt different. The young woman, who had remained curled up against the wall, looked up as he approached. Her eyes, tired but observant, tracked his every move, as if unsure whether to trust him or run. Andrew handed her the sandwich without saying a word. "Thank you," she mumbled, unwrapping the food slowly, as though still expecting it to be snatched away. She ate cautiously, stealing glances at Andrew, who stood there, unsure of what to say next. Normally, he would have walked away by now, his conscience satisfied by the simple act of charity. But something held him there, an inexplicable need to understand why this woman felt so familiar. He cleared his throat, awkwardly breaking the silence. "What's your name?" She paused, mid-bite, before responding. "Maggie." Andrew studied her for a moment. "Do you have a place to stay?" Maggie shook her head slowly, her eyes dropping to the ground. "Not anymore." "How long have you been out here?" he asked, his voice calm but distant, as if he were conducting a business inquiry. "Couple of months, maybe," she replied, her tone indifferent. It was clear she had grown used to her circumstances. Time blurs together after a while. Andrew felt an unfamiliar tug of emotion. Sympathy, perhaps, though it was a foreign feeling for him. He wasn't accustomed to dealing with people like Maggie. His world was one of tailored suits, board meetings, and billion-dollar deals. He didn't understand this kind of struggle, nor had he ever wanted to. But as he stood there, watching Maggie, memories began to surface. They were vague and disjointed at first, images of his sister, Sarah, back when they were younger. She had been headstrong and rebellious, refusing to conform to the expectations placed on the Montgomery family. And then, she was gone, cast out, her name never spoken again. Andrew blinked, pushing the thought away. It wasn't the time for memories. He forced himself to focus on the present. "You can't stay out here," he said, his voice firmer now. "I'll help you find somewhere safe." Maggie looked up, her brows furrowing in suspicion. "Why?" she asked, her tone sharp, guarded. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Andrew hesitated, not entirely sure how to answer that himself. He wasn't known for his compassion, and certainly not for helping strangers. But something about Maggie felt unsettlingly familiar, a sensation he couldn't shake. "I don't know," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "Maybe I should just leave. But I'm not going to." She watched him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing, as though trying to see through him. There was a pause, and then she finally sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll come with you. But just for tonight." Andrew nodded, more relieved than he expected to feel. "I'll arrange for a hotel," he said, already pulling out his phone. He had 1,000 options at his disposal. Contacts, services, resources. But for some reason, he felt like this situation required more than just money. As he dialed, Maggie's eyes lingered on him, her wariness still present. "I've seen you before," she said quietly, almost as if to herself. "On TV or something. You're rich, aren't you?" Andrew's fingers hovered over the phone, and he looked at her, a small smirk forming. "Something like that." Maggie stared at him for a second longer, then returned to her sandwich, eating in silence while Andrew made the call. When he finished, he tucked the phone away and glanced back at her. "It's done. The hotel's nearby." Maggie looked at him suspiciously but nodded. "Okay, let's go." As they walked, Andrew felt a sense of discomfort creep over him. He was out of his element, navigating a situation that required more than just wealth or power. Maggie's silence didn't help either, and the weight of the strangeness between them hung in the air like a thick fog. When they reached the hotel, Andrew led her to the front desk, where the concierge greeted him with the usual respect that came with his name. "Mr. Montgomery, welcome back. How can we assist you tonight?" "I need a room for her," Andrew said, nodding toward Maggie, who was standing awkwardly behind him, her shoulders hunched as though trying to make herself smaller. The concierge's eyes flicked to Maggie, and though he hid it well, Andrew could see the brief flash of judgment that crossed his face. Andrew felt a sudden surge of anger, though he wasn't sure why it bothered him. Of course, the man replied smoothly, "We'll arrange everything." "Miss, please follow me." Maggie hesitated, glancing back at Andrew. "You're not staying, are you?" Andrew shook his head. "No, but I'll check in tomorrow. Make sure you're all right." Maggie frowned, uncertainty flashing in her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice quieter this time, almost vulnerable. Andrew didn't have an answer that made sense, not even to himself. "Just get some rest," he said, dodging the question. "We'll talk tomorrow." Without waiting for her response, he turned and left, the cool night air hitting him as he stepped back onto the street. As he walked away from the hotel, Andrew's mind raced. Maggie was just a random homeless girl he had found on the street, nothing more. Yet, something about her stirred memories he had long buried. Memories of Sarah, of the past he had tried to forget. He pulled his coat tighter around him, the weight of the evening settling on his shoulders. For years, he had lived in a bubble of privilege and control, avoiding the messiness of human connection. But now, for reasons he couldn't explain, that bubble had been pierced, and he felt its effects deep within him. As Andrew walked into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Maggie's presence, her strange familiarity, had awakened something in him, something that he wasn't ready to confront. But soon, he would have no choice. The next morning, Andrew Montgomery sat at his desk, staring blankly at the reports scattered in front of him. The numbers, the projections, the deals, they all blurred together, unable to hold his focus. His mind kept drifting back to the previous night, to Maggie. He had spent the entire evening questioning why he had stopped, why he had felt compelled to help her. It didn't make sense. Yet, here he was, caught in a strange pull he didn't understand. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a message from the hotel's concierge, letting him know that Maggie had checked out and was waiting in the lobby. "She's probably gone," Andrew muttered to himself, irritated by the flicker of disappointment he felt. Maybe that was for the best. It was a mistake to get involved with someone like her. But as the minutes passed, the curiosity gnawed at him, compelling him to get up from his desk. Moments later, Andrew's sleek black car pulled up to the hotel. He stepped out and walked through the grand entrance, his presence commanding attention as always. The staff greeted him with their usual professionalism, but his eyes were already scanning the lobby, searching for Maggie. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the street, lost in thought. She looked different in the light of day. Younger, more fragile, though still guarded. Her clothes were clean, and she looked slightly more put together, but the weight of her circumstances was clear in the way she held herself, tense and closed off. Andrew approached her, and she looked up as he neared, her expression neutral but wary. "You didn't leave," he said, almost as if it surprised him. Maggie shrugged. "Where would I go?" For a moment, Andrew was at a loss. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He had assumed she would be gone by now, that this whole encounter would have been a one-time act of charity, and he could return to his life without further complications. But she was still here, and now he had no idea what to do next. "Did you sleep all right?" he asked awkwardly, trying to fill the silence. Maggie gave a half shrug, her eyes scanning the lobby nervously. "Better than the streets." There was an edge to her voice, a guardedness that Andrew recognized. He had seen it before, in people who had nothing left to lose, who had built walls around themselves to survive. He had those same walls once, though they had been built from ambition rather than desperation. Andrew cleared his throat, shifting his weight slightly. "You don't have anywhere to go?" "No," Maggie answered flatly. "Not really." He hesitated, his mind racing. He could walk away now, hand her a few $100s, and be done with it. But something kept him there, rooted in place, unwilling to abandon her just yet. "There's a shelter nearby," he began. But the words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. Maggie glanced up at him sharply, as if offended by the suggestion. "A shelter?" she scoffed. "I've been through enough of those. They don't help." Andrew sighed, feeling out of his depth. This wasn't his world. He had no idea how to navigate these situations. But as he looked at Maggie, something shifted. For years, he had been numb, operating on autopilot, making decisions based purely on logic and profit. Now, standing in front of this woman, he felt a stir of empathy, a desire to do more than just walk away. "Why don't you stay somewhere more permanent?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I have an apartment. You can stay there for a while, until you figure things out." Maggie blinked, her expression hardening as if she were waiting for the punchline. "Are you serious?" she asked, suspicion lacing her tone. Andrew nodded, surprised at himself. "I'm serious." "Why would you do that?" she demanded, standing up abruptly. Her sudden movement caught the attention of the concierge, but she ignored him. "I don't know you. You don't know me. People like you don't help people like me for no reason. So, what's the catch?" Andrew raised his hands, trying to calm her down. "There's no catch. I'm just offering you a place to stay. No strings attached." Maggie crossed her arms, glaring at him, her posture tense. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Andrew replied firmly. "It's just a place to stay, for a little while. You can get back on your feet, figure things out, and then you can leave. I don't expect anything in return." For a long moment, Maggie stood there, eyes narrowed, studying him as though trying to see past his polished exterior, trying to decipher his intentions. She didn't trust him, that much was obvious, but there was something in her gaze, something that softened, just slightly, as if she were beginning to consider the offer. "You're not the first rich guy to feel guilty and throw money at a problem," Maggie said finally, her voice cold. "But I'm not some charity case you can save to make yourself feel better." Andrew exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't about guilt. I'm just offering you a chance. If you don't want it, fine. But if you do, the offer stands." There was another pause, thick with tension, and Andrew wondered if he had pushed too far. But after what felt like an eternity, Maggie's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of her. "Fine," she muttered, her voice low and reluctant. "But just for a little while." Andrew nodded. Just for a while. As they left the hotel and climbed into the car, the silence between them was heavy. Andrew could sense Maggie's unease, her wariness. She sat stiffly in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the passing streets, as though she was ready to bolt at any moment. Andrew drove in silence, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. He didn't know her, and she didn't trust him, but there was something about her presence that tugged at him, an invisible thread tying them together, though he couldn't yet see why. The car pulled up to a modest apartment building, one of many properties Andrew owned in the city. He had purchased it years ago, though he rarely visited. It was meant to be an escape, a place to retreat when the chaos of his life became too much. He hadn't expected to be bringing someone like Maggie here. Inside, the apartment was sparsely furnished but comfortable. Maggie stepped inside cautiously, looking around, her eyes flicking to every corner as though she expected the walls to close in on her. "This place is yours for now," Andrew said, breaking the silence. "I'll leave you alone, but if you need anything—" "I won't," Maggie interrupted, her voice sharp. "I don't need anything from you." Andrew clenched his jaw, trying not to take her words personally. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll check in with you later." As he turned to leave, Maggie called out after him, her voice softer this time. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. Andrew paused, his hand on the door handle, but he didn't turn around. "I don't know," he answered honestly, before walking out. As the door clicked shut behind him, Andrew exhaled, feeling the weight of the strange encounter settle on his shoulders. He didn't know why he had offered her the apartment. He didn't know why he couldn't just walk away. But one thing was certain. There was something about Maggie that pulled at him, something that connected them in ways he didn't yet understand. And deep down, Andrew feared what that connection might reveal. Andrew spent the next few days going through the motions of his usual routine, but something was different. His mind kept drifting back to Maggie and the unsettling feeling that had gnawed at him since their encounter. It wasn't just her situation that troubled him. It was her face, her eyes. The strange familiarity haunted him, like a half-forgotten dream just out of reach. He buried himself in work, hoping the relentless pace of meetings and financial reports would distract him. But every time he found a moment of quiet, Maggie crept back into his thoughts. He wondered how she was settling into the apartment, whether she had found any peace. He hadn't called or checked on her, deciding to give her space. But deep down, he knew he couldn't avoid her for long. That evening, as Andrew sat alone in his penthouse, the distant hum of the city below a constant companion, a sudden memory flashed through his mind. It was a memory he had long since buried, from a time when his family was still intact, before the scandal, before everything fell apart. He saw his sister, Sarah, standing in the hallway of their family's estate, tears streaming down her face. She had been younger then, in her early 20s, and the family had just discovered her secret. She was pregnant. The news had hit like a bomb, sending shockwaves through their conservative, image-obsessed family. Sarah had begged for understanding, pleaded for mercy, but their father had been unforgiving. He was a man who valued reputation above all else, and the thought of a scandal tarnishing the Montgomery name was unthinkable. Andrew had been there, too, standing silently beside their father as Sarah was cast out. He had said nothing as she packed her bags and left, her sobs echoing through the grand halls of their home. He had told himself it was for the best, that Sarah's mistake had to be dealt with swiftly and harshly. But the guilt had never truly left him. He had abandoned her when she needed him the most. Andrew blinked, shaking off the memory. It had been years since he thought about Sarah. She had disappeared from their lives after that, and Andrew had buried himself in work, determined to forget the messiness of his family. But now, sitting in the dimly lit penthouse, the memory felt closer than ever. His phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. It was a text from Vanessa, his assistant, reminding him about a meeting the next morning. He glanced at it briefly before tossing the phone onto the table, the glow of the screen fading as it fell. He needed to know more about Maggie. The nagging feeling that she was connected to his past in some way had only grown stronger. And if she was connected to Sarah, if she was somehow involved in the painful history he had tried to escape, Andrew didn't know how he would handle it. With a deep breath, Andrew stood and grabbed his coat. He had avoided visiting Maggie since he left her at the apartment, but now he had no choice. He needed answers. When he arrived at the apartment, the building was quiet, the hallway dimly lit. Andrew paused outside the door, hesitating for the briefest of moments before knocking. A few seconds passed, and the door opened slightly. Maggie stood there, her expression a mixture of surprise and guarded suspicion. "You said you'd check in later," she muttered, crossing her arms. "Didn't think you meant this soon." Andrew offered a slight, awkward smile. "I thought I'd see how you're doing." Maggie's eyes narrowed. "Why do I get the feeling this isn't just a courtesy visit?" Andrew stepped inside, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. I need to ask you something," he began, his voice uncertain. "It's about your family." Maggie's face hardened instantly. She took a step back, folding her arms across her chest. "I don't talk about my family," she said flatly. "That's not part of the deal." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. "I understand, but—" "No," Maggie interrupted, her voice sharp. "You don't understand. You have no idea what I've been through." Andrew stopped, taking a breath. He had pushed too hard, and he could see the walls going up around her. But he couldn't let it go, not now. Not with the memories of Sarah hanging over him like a dark cloud. "I need to know if you're connected to someone from my past," he said quietly, his voice strained. "My sister, Sarah Montgomery." The moment the name left his lips, Maggie's face froze, her eyes widening in shock. She quickly looked away, but Andrew had already seen the truth in her expression. His heart pounded in his chest as the pieces began to fall into place. Maggie's face, her mannerisms, the strange familiarity, it all clicked. She was connected to Sarah. She had to be. Maggie remained silent, her body tense, but the truth was written all over her face. Andrew stepped closer, his voice softer now. "Please, just tell me the truth." Maggie shook her head, her eyes welling up with emotion she had clearly tried to bury. "What does it matter?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It won't change anything." "It matters to me," Andrew replied, his own voice cracking slightly. "It matters more than you know." For a long moment, The room was filled with the sound of Maggie's shaky breathing. Then, with a heavy sigh, she lowered her head. "Sarah Montgomery," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's my mother." Andrew staggered back, the weight of the revelation hitting him like a freight train. His heart raced, his mind spinning as he tried to process what he had just heard. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. Maggie nodded, her eyes glistening with tears she was desperately trying to hold back. "She died a few years ago. I was on my own after that. She never talked much about your family. But I knew enough." Andrew's legs felt weak, and he sank into the nearest chair, his hands trembling. Maggie, his niece, had been living on the streets, while he had been living in luxury, completely unaware of her existence. He had failed her, just as he had failed Sarah. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice broken. "I didn't know she had a child. I didn't know about you." Maggie laughed bitterly, swiping at her tears. "Of course, you didn't. Why would you? Your family cut her out. You all pretended like she never existed. And I was just the mistake she left behind." Andrew looked at her, his heart aching in a way it hadn't in years. The guilt, the shame, everything he had tried to bury was crashing back down on him, tenfold. He had abandoned Sarah. He had left her to suffer alone, and now her daughter, his niece, had paid the price for his coldness. "I'm sorry," Andrew said, the words feeling inadequate, but it was all he had. "I didn't know. I didn't." "Stop," Maggie snapped, her voice cutting through the air. "Don't apologize. It's too late for that." Andrew fell silent, his chest heavy with regret. He had no right to ask for forgiveness. But as he looked at Maggie, standing there, so angry and so hurt, he knew he had to try. He couldn't walk away again. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly, standing up and meeting her gaze. "But I want to make this right. I don't know how, but I will." Maggie scoffed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "You can't fix this. You can't bring her back. And you can't erase the years I spent alone because of you." Andrew flinched at the words, but he nodded. "I know, but I won't walk away this time. I won't leave you." Maggie stared at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, anger, pain, and something else. Something that looked almost like hope, though it was buried deep beneath her walls of distrust. "Why now?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost vulnerable. "Why are you here now?" Andrew swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Because I can't run from this anymore," he admitted. "Because I made a mistake with your mother, and I don't want to make the same mistake with you." Maggie's eyes filled with tears again, but she said nothing. The silence between them was thick, charged with unspoken words and years of pain. Andrew didn't know how to fix this. He didn't know if it could be fixed, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to lose her, too. The days following Maggie's revelation were a blur for Andrew. He returned to his office, to the world of wealth and power he had spent decades building, but it felt hollow now. Every deal, every conversation, every meeting seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what he had just learned. His mind kept going back to Maggie, to her face when she had finally told him the truth, to the anger and pain in her eyes. She was his niece, the daughter of the sister he had abandoned. The thought gnawed at him constantly, filling him with a shame he couldn't escape. Andrew had kept his distance for a few days, giving Maggie space, but he knew it was time to talk to her again. He needed to know more about Sarah, about the years he had missed, about the pain Maggie had endured because of his family's choices. And though part of him dreaded hearing it, he couldn't avoid it any longer. It was early evening when Andrew finally returned to the apartment. The air outside was crisp, the city's noise distant but constant. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead, and knocked on the door. It opened after a few moments, and Maggie stood there, her expression unreadable. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. The apartment was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the last time he had been there. The silence between them was thick with tension, neither of them knowing quite how to begin. Andrew sat down on the couch, while Maggie lingered by the window, arms crossed. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp. "I need to know more," Andrew said, looking at her carefully. I need to know about Sarah, about what happened to her after she left. Maggie's face hardened, her jaw tightening as she looked away. It's not a story you're going to like, she muttered. I don't care, Andrew replied quietly. I need to hear it. Maggie let out a harsh breath and sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Fine, she said after a long pause. You want the truth? Here it is. She stared at him, her eyes cold. After your family threw her out, Sarah had nowhere to go. She was pregnant, scared, and completely alone. She tried to get in touch with you, with your father, but no one wanted anything to do with her. She ended up staying with a friend for a while, but that didn't last. People turned their backs on her once they realized she was a Montgomery. She became a liability, a reminder of your family's dirty little secret. Andrew's heart sank as he listened, each word cutting deeper than the last. She never told me, he whispered, more to himself than to Maggie. I didn't know she tried to reach out. Maggie's eyes flashed with anger. Of course she did. But your father made sure no one answered her calls. No one wanted the scandal to resurface. So, she had to figure things out on her own. Andrew clenched his fists, the guilt rising in him like a tidal wave. What happened after that? Maggie's face softened, just slightly. She had me, she continued, her voice quieter now. But it wasn't easy. She struggled, Andrew. She worked whatever jobs she could find, just trying to make ends meet. We moved around a lot, different cities, different apartments. It was never stable, but she loved me. She tried her best. Andrew's chest tightened at the thought of his sister, alone and struggling, while he had lived in luxury. He had never imagined her life could have been this hard. She never talked much about your family, Maggie added, her eyes distant. But I knew something happened. I knew you abandoned her. Andrew flinched at the accusation, the truth hitting him harder than he expected. I didn't. He stopped himself, realizing there was no excuse he could offer that would make any of this better. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice hoarse. Maggie shook her head, her face twisting with bitterness. Sorry doesn't change anything. She was sick for years before she died. I took care of her as best I could, but we didn't have money. She didn't have insurance. By the time she got to a doctor, it was too late. Andrew felt like he had been punched in the gut. Sick? He whispered. With what? Heart disease, Maggie replied bitterly. Completely preventable if we had gotten her the right treatment. But we didn't. We couldn't afford it. Andrew dropped his head into his hands, his chest heaving with guilt. He had been so far removed from Sarah's life, so focused on his own ambition, that he hadn't even known she was suffering. He hadn't known she was sick. She never asked for help, Maggie continued, her voice wavering. She was too proud, too hurt by what you all did to her. She never wanted to beg. Andrew lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed. I would have helped her if I had known, he said desperately. I swear I didn't know, Maggie. Maggie stared at him, her expression unreadable. But you didn't care enough to find out, she said quietly. You could have reached out. You could have tried. But you didn't. The words hung in the air, thick with accusation, and Andrew couldn't deny them. He hadn't cared. He had been too focused on protecting the family name, too focused on rising to the top of the business world. Sarah's suffering had been an afterthought, something he had pushed to the back of his mind because it was easier not to think about it. You're right, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I failed her. I failed both of you. For the first time, Maggie's face softened, her hardened exterior cracking just a little. She looked at him, her eyes still filled with pain. But something else was there too, something fragile, like a flicker of understanding. She didn't hate you, Maggie said softly. She was angry, but she never hated you. She missed you, Andrew. She missed her brother. Andrew's throat tightened, his heart breaking at the thought of Sarah missing him, even after everything he had done. He had let her down in the worst way possible, and now she was gone. He would never be able to make things right with her. But it's too late, Maggie continued, her voice barely a whisper. She's gone, and I was left alone. The pain in her words was palpable, and Andrew could barely look at her. The weight of his guilt, of his failure, pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He had failed his sister, and now he had failed her daughter. "I want to help you," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how, but I want to make this right." Maggie shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "You can't make this right. You can't fix what's already broken." Andrew stood, his chest tightening with desperation. "I know I can't bring her back. I know I can't erase the past, but I can be here for you. I can help you. Please, let me do that." Maggie's gaze flicked away, her defenses rising again. "You think you can just waltz in and fix everything with money?" she asked bitterly. "That's not how it works." "I'm not trying to fix it with money," Andrew insisted. "I'm trying to be the family you deserve. I don't want to fail you too." Maggie was silent for a long time, her eyes locked on the floor. When she finally looked up, her expression was softer, though still wary. "I don't need your money, Andrew," she said quietly. I just don't want to be alone anymore." The words hit Andrew like a punch to the gut. He had spent so long surrounded by wealth and power, but it had left him isolated and emotionally empty. And now, in front of him, was the only family he had left, a niece he barely knew but desperately wanted to protect. "You're not alone anymore," Andrew said softly, his voice trembling. "I promise you, you're not alone." Maggie stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, as if trying to see whether his words were real. Finally, she gave a small, hesitant nod, the tears in her eyes threatening to spill over. Andrew stepped closer, unsure if the gesture would be welcome, but needing to offer some kind of comfort. To his surprise, Maggie didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and wiped her eyes. "I don't know how to do this," Maggie admitted, her voice fragile. "I don't know how to trust you." Andrew nodded, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't know how either, but I'll be here. I won't leave you." Maggie gave him a small, tentative look, her defenses slowly crumbling. For the first time, Andrew saw something in her that wasn't anger or pain. It was the faintest glimmer of hope. "Okay," she whispered, "we'll try." The days that followed were unlike anything Andrew Montgomery had ever experienced. He found himself navigating an emotional landscape he had long forgotten existed, one filled with uncertainty, guilt, and the unfamiliar bond he was beginning to form with Maggie. It wasn't easy. Every conversation felt like a delicate dance, both of them trying to find a way forward while grappling with the pain of their shared past. Maggie had agreed to stay at the apartment, though she kept her distance, clearly unsure of how to let Andrew into her life. He didn't push her. Instead, he tried to show her that he was there for the long haul, that this wasn't just a fleeting act of guilt, but a genuine attempt to be the family she had never had. Andrew, for his part, was struggling with his own demons. The more time he spent around Maggie, the more his memories of Sarah came flooding back. Every time he looked at her, he saw the echoes of his sister's face, the same fierce independence, the same sharpness in her eyes. And it tore him apart, knowing that he had been the one to let Sarah down. He had played a role in her downfall, and now he was staring at the consequences of that betrayal in the form of her daughter. One evening, after a long day at work, Andrew found himself sitting in his penthouse, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the glowing skyline of New York City. The world below him continued to move forward. Business deals were struck, lives were lived, fortunes were made and lost. But here, in the quiet of his apartment, Andrew felt utterly lost. The guilt was a constant companion now, following him wherever he went. He had tried to bury it, had spent years convincing himself that he had done what was necessary, what was right for the Montgomery family. But now, looking back, he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been for nothing. What had he really gained? Wealth? Power? Prestige? None of it felt meaningful anymore, not in the face of the devastation it had caused. As the ice in his glass clinked softly, Andrew's mind wandered back to the last time he had seen Sarah. It was years ago, after their father had kicked her out. He had visited her once, a brief and awkward meeting in a rundown apartment somewhere in Queens. She had been different then, hardened, distant, a shadow of the vibrant sister he had once known. He hadn't stayed long, and they hadn't spoken much. He had told himself that it was better that way, that Sarah had made her choice, and that he needed to focus on his own path. But now, with the weight of hindsight pressing down on him, Andrew realized how much of a coward he had been. He hadn't been there for Sarah, not when she needed him most. He had taken the easy way out, retreating into the cold world of business, where emotions were a liability and compassion was a weakness. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Andrew set down his glass and crossed the room, opening the door to find Maggie standing there. She looked hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she should be there, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that Andrew hadn't seen before. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. Andrew nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Maggie walked into the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though she was trying to hold herself together. She glanced around the penthouse, her eyes scanning the luxury and wealth that surrounded them, before finally turning back to Andrew. "I needed to talk to you," she said, her voice soft but tense. "About everything. About my mom. About you." Andrew's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Okay," he said, motioning for her to sit down. "Let's talk." Maggie sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stared at the floor for a moment, as if trying to gather her thoughts, before finally speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, her voice low and uncertain, "about trying to make things right. And I want to believe you, Andrew. I really do. But it's hard." Andrew nodded, his chest tightening. "I understand," he said gently. "I know I can't undo what happened, but I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life. I want to help." Maggie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and confusion. "But why now?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you care before? Where were you when my mom was dying? Where were you when we had nothing?" Andrew felt the guilt rising up again, choking him. He had no good answers for her. All he could do was tell the truth. "I was blind," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I was so focused on building my life, on protecting the family name, that I lost sight of what really mattered. I abandoned Sarah. I abandoned you. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Maggie's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them away, her jaw tightening as she fought to maintain control. "She used to talk about you, you know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She missed you, even after everything, even after what you did." Andrew closed his eyes, the weight of her words crushing him. Sarah had missed him. Despite everything, she had still cared about him, and he had failed her in the worst possible way. "I wish I could go back," Andrew said, his voice strained. "I wish I could have been there for her, for you, but I can't change the past. All I can do is try to be here for you now." Maggie wiped at her eyes, her walls crumbling, though her voice remained sharp. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to trust you. I don't know if I can." Andrew's heart ached at her words, but he understood. Trust wasn't something that could be built overnight. It had to be earned, and Andrew knew he had a long way to go. "You don't have to trust me yet," he said softly, "but I'll be here, every day, for as long as it takes." For a long moment, Maggie said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the years they had both lost. But slowly, tentatively, she nodded. It wasn't an acceptance of his apology, but it was a step, a small, fragile step towards something they both desperately needed, a chance to heal. Andrew felt a flicker of hope, though it was tempered by the enormity of the task ahead. He had failed his family once, but he wouldn't fail again. He couldn't. As Maggie stood up to leave, Andrew spoke one last time. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Maggie. I'm just asking for a chance." She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. She didn't look back, but her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I'll think about it." With that, she walked out, leaving Andrew standing alone in the dimly lit room. The weight of the past still pressed heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Maggie down. Not again. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of cautious steps forward and painful reminders of the past. Andrew tried to be patient, knowing that the wounds between him and Maggie ran deep, and healing them wouldn't be quick or easy. Every interaction felt like treading on broken glass, careful, slow, and sometimes painful. Maggie had stayed in the apartment, but she remained distant. She would come and go as she pleased, often disappearing for hours without explanation, returning late into the night. Andrew didn't ask where she went or what she was doing. He knew she valued her independence and that pressing her would only push her further away. But it was hard for him. Every time she left, he worried. She had lived on the streets for so long, and the fear that she might slip back into that life gnawed at him constantly. He tried to offer her more. Money, a car, connections that could help her, but Maggie rejected every attempt. "I don't need your charity," she had snapped one evening when Andrew had suggested he could help her find a job. "I can take care of myself." Andrew had swallowed his frustration, forcing himself to back off. He knew he couldn't force Maggie to trust him. She had to come to that decision on her own. One rainy evening, Andrew returned to the apartment earlier than usual. He had canceled his meetings for the day, his mind too preoccupied to focus on business. He was about to head into his bedroom when he noticed the door to Maggie's room was slightly ajar, the soft glow of a lamp spilling into the hallway. He hesitated, unsure whether to knock or give her space. But something compelled him forward, and he gently pushed the door open. Maggie was sitting on the bed, an old, worn photo album open in her lap. She hadn't noticed him yet, her eyes locked on the pictures, her face unreadable. Andrew cleared his throat softly, and Maggie looked up, startled. Her expression quickly shifted to guardedness, her body tensing as though she was preparing for a confrontation. "I didn't mean to intrude," Andrew said quickly. "I just saw the light." Maggie shrugged, closing the album slowly. "It's fine," she muttered, though her tone was distant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the silence. Andrew glanced at the album in her lap, his heart tightening at the thought of what memories it might hold. "Is that pictures of your mom?" Maggie hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, it's one of the only things I still have of hers." Andrew stepped closer, cautiously, unsure if his presence was welcome. "Can I see?" Maggie looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she scooted over on the bed, making room for him. Andrew sat down beside her, his heart racing with a mix of hope and dread. Maggie opened the album again, flipping through the pages slowly. The photographs were old, many of them faded, but they told a story. There were pictures of Sarah, younger and full of life, her smile radiant as she held a baby Maggie in her arms. There were snapshots of birthdays, of small, intimate moments that Andrew had missed entirely. Andrew stared at the pictures in silence, his throat tight with emotion. He had missed so much. He had missed Sarah's life, her struggles, her joy. And he had missed Maggie growing up, watching her turn into the person she was now. It was a strange, painful feeling, seeing these moments frozen in time, knowing he had been absent for all of them. "She loved you, you know," Maggie said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Her eyes were fixed on a picture of Sarah, standing on a beach with the wind in her hair, a soft smile on her face. "Even after everything, she still loved you." Andrew swallowed hard, his chest aching. "I loved her too," he whispered. I didn't know how to show it. I didn't know how to be there for her." Maggie looked at him, her expression softening, though there was still a layer of hurt in her eyes. "She needed you," she said quietly, "and you weren't there." Andrew nodded, his gaze falling to his hands. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I'll never forgive myself for that." Maggie didn't respond, and for a while, they sat in silence, the weight of the past hanging between them. Andrew's eyes drifted over the photos, each one a painful reminder of the years he had lost. But as the minutes passed, he felt something shift, a sense that the distance between them was shrinking, even if only by a fraction. "You remind me of her," Andrew said after a long pause, his voice quiet. "The way you carry yourself, the way you don't back down. You've got her strength." Maggie's lips twitched slightly, almost as if she wanted to smile but didn't know how. "She always told me I was stubborn like her," she said softly, closing the album and setting it aside. Andrew looked at her, his chest swelling with a mixture of sorrow and affection. "I see it. She'd be proud of you." Maggie blinked, clearly taken aback by his words. Her eyes flicked away, and she stood up abruptly, crossing the room to the window. Andrew could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she struggled to keep her emotions in check. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to be around you. I spent so long hating your family, hating you." Andrew stood as well, keeping his distance but speaking softly. "I understand. You don't have to rush this, Maggie. I don't expect you to just forget everything." Maggie turned to face him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I don't want to hate you anymore," she whispered. "But it's hard. Every time I look at you, I see all the things I never had. The life I could have had if things had been different." Andrew's heart broke at her words. He had spent so long running from his guilt, but now it was staring him in the face, embodied in the woman standing in front of him. "I wish I could change the past," he said, his voice trembling. "I wish I could have been there for you, for Sarah, but I can't. All I can do is try to be here now." Maggie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't let them fall. She was still holding herself together, still keeping her walls up. "It's not that easy," she said, shaking her head. "It's not just about showing up now. It's about all the years I spent alone. All the pain we went through because your family threw us away." Andrew stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I know I can't undo that, but I don't want to leave you alone anymore. I want to be the family you deserve, Maggie, even if it takes time, even if you never fully forgive me. I'm not going anywhere." Maggie stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, looking for something, perhaps sincerity, perhaps hope. Slowly, her posture softened, and she wiped at her eyes, the first crack in her armor appearing. "I don't know if I can trust you yet," she whispered, her voice shaky. "But I don't want to be alone anymore either." Andrew's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and sadness. He stepped closer, cautiously, as if afraid to break the fragile moment between them. "You won't be," he promised. "Not anymore." Maggie nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor, as if the weight of everything they had just shared was too much to bear all at once. She took a deep breath, composing herself, and then finally looked up at him again. There was still pain in her eyes, still uncertainty, but there was something else too, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the first small step toward healing. "I'm willing to try," Maggie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew felt a wave of emotion crash over him, but he kept it in check, nodding gently. "That's all I ask," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "We'll take it one day at a time." Maggie didn't say anything more, but the slight nod of her head, the softening of her expression, was enough for now. It wasn't a full reconciliation, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. It was a start. As Maggie turned and left the room, leaving Andrew alone with the photo album and the memories it held, he realized just how much work lay ahead. There was still so much pain to unpack, so much trust to rebuild. But for the first time in years, Andrew felt a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. He wasn't sure how, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But he had made a promise, to Sarah, to Maggie, and to himself. He wasn't going to walk away this time. The days blurred together as Andrew and Maggie fell into an uneasy rhythm, each of them navigating their way through the tangled emotions and unresolved pain that lingered between them. Though there were no more explosive confrontations, the air between them remained heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of their shared past. Andrew could feel that Maggie was still holding back, not quite ready to trust him, but at least now, she wasn't pulling away entirely. It was a small step, but in their fractured relationship, it was significant. One afternoon, as Andrew was sitting at his office desk, reviewing financial reports that now seemed trivial compared to the emotional storm brewing inside him, his phone rang. He picked it up, expecting it to be a client or Vanessa, but instead, Maggie's voice came through the line. "I want to visit her," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. Andrew's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to ask who she meant. He knew. Sarah's grave? He asked, his voice soft.
Yes.
There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Maggie spoke again, her voice was tinged with something deeper, something more fragile than he had heard before. I haven't been back since the funeral. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He hadn't been to Sarah's grave at all. The guilt had kept him away, a gnawing reminder of the role he had played in her exile, her suffering. But now, with Maggie asking him to go, it was impossible to refuse. I'll go with you, he said firmly. Maggie hesitated. You don't have to. I want to. Andrew interrupted gently. If you're ready, then so am I. There was another pause, but this time it felt less tense. Finally, Maggie agreed. Tomorrow morning. I'll meet you at the apartment. The next morning, the weather was somber, as if the sky itself understood the gravity of the day. Gray clouds hung low, casting a dreary pallor over the city as Andrew arrived at the apartment. Maggie was waiting outside, bundled in a worn coat, her expression guarded but determined. Without exchanging many words, they got into Andrew's car and drove out of the city, the tension between them thick but not hostile. Maggie stared out of the window, lost in her thoughts, while Andrew gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his own emotions churning just beneath the surface. After an hour of driving, they arrived at the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, peaceful, with rows of headstones stretching out over the rolling hills. Andrew had always imagined Sarah resting in a place like this, a place removed from the chaos of the city, where the noise of life couldn't disturb her anymore. Maggie led the way, her steps deliberate as they walked through the rows of graves. When they finally reached Sarah's headstone, Maggie stopped, her gaze locked on the simple marble slab that bore her mother's name. Andrew felt a lump rise in his throat as he read the inscription. Sarah Montgomery, beloved mother. 1976 to 2014. He stared at the name, the dates, feeling the full weight of time pressed down on him. 10 years had passed since her death, but the regret felt as fresh as ever. Maggie knelt down, brushing her fingers gently over the engraved letters, her expression unreadable. Andrew stood a few steps behind her, unsure of what to say. He had come prepared to offer some kind of comfort, but now, standing in front of his sister's grave, he felt utterly helpless. I never got to say goodbye, Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She was gone. One day she was sick, and the next, she was gone. Andrew's chest tightened. He could feel the anguish in Maggie's words, the raw grief that she had been carrying for years. I'm sorry, he said, his voice hoarse. I should have been there. For both of you. Maggie didn't respond at first. She remained kneeling, her head bowed as the wind rustled the nearby trees. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice low but steady. She loved you, you know? She told me that, even at the end. Andrew closed his eyes, pain washing over him. I don't deserve that, he murmured. I don't deserve her forgiveness. Maggie stood slowly, turning to face him. Her eyes were red, but she held herself strong, her shoulders squared as if she had made a decision. Maybe not, she said softly, but she gave it to you anyway. Andrew felt a tear slip down his cheek before he could stop it. He hadn't cried in years. He had trained himself to bury his emotions, to stay composed no matter the situation. But standing here, in front of Sarah's grave, with her daughter offering him a forgiveness he didn't deserve, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. I failed her, he whispered, his voice cracking. I let her down when she needed me most. I let you down. Maggie took a deep breath, her expression softening as she stepped closer to him. You did, she said bluntly, but you're here now, and maybe that's what matters. Andrew looked at her, surprised by her words. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just the raw truth. And somehow, it felt like the first step towards something real. I don't know how to make up for the past, Andrew admitted, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I ever can. Maggie nodded, her gaze drifting back to the grave. You can't, she said simply, but you can try. That's all we have. isn't it? The chance to try. Andrew nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. He had spent years avoiding this moment, but now, standing here, he knew there was no more running. He would face his past, no matter how painful it was, and he would try, every day, to make things right with Maggie. "I will," he said quietly. "I'll keep trying." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the past hanging between them. But this time, it felt different. There was no more blame, no more anger, just the quiet, shared understanding that they were both survivors of the same pain. And maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. After leaving the cemetery, the drive back to the city was quieter, but the tension between them had eased. Maggie seemed more at peace, though Andrew could tell she was still processing everything. He didn't push her, knowing that trust would take time. But the fact that she had asked him to come with her, that she had let him in, even for this moment, felt like progress. When they arrived back at the apartment, Maggie turned to him before getting out of the car. "Thank you," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his, "for coming with me." Andrew smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Thank you for letting me." She nodded, then hesitated for a moment, as if she wanted to say more. Finally, she added, "We're not fixed, Andrew, but today it helped." Andrew's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and relief. "That's all I could ask for," he said softly. Maggie opened the door and stepped out, pausing briefly before looking back at him. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, her voice almost gentle. Andrew watched her walk inside, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. He knew this wasn't the end of their journey. There were still scars that would take time to heal, still truths that would need to be faced. But for the first time, he felt like they were moving toward something better, toward the possibility of being a family again, even if it was a new kind of family. As Andrew sat in the car, the sound of the rain tapping softly on the windows, he looked out at the city before him. For so long, this city had represented everything he had built, his empire, his success, his carefully constructed life. But now, as he thought of Maggie, of Sarah, and of the new path he was determined to take, the city seemed different. It wasn't about power or wealth anymore. It was about connection, about redemption, about the chance to build something real, even after years of mistakes. Andrew took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the feeling of hope settle in. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. The weeks after the visit to Sarah's grave marked a subtle but meaningful shift between Andrew and Maggie. Their interactions, once filled with tension and guarded exchanges, became more natural, though still tentative. The emotional walls between them were beginning to come down, brick by brick, but the journey ahead was still long. For the first time in years, Andrew felt as if he were on the right path, even though the guilt of the past still haunted him. One crisp autumn afternoon, Maggie appeared at Andrew's office unannounced. It was a rare visit, as she typically avoided his corporate world, a place she had never felt comfortable. Andrew was in the middle of a conference call, but the moment he saw her standing in the doorway, her face serious, he ended the call and gestured for her to come in. "Something wrong?" Andrew asked, concern lacing his voice as he stepped around his desk to greet her. Maggie shook her head, though her expression remained somber. "No, nothing's wrong. I need to talk to you." Andrew's stomach tightened. The last time she had used that tone, they had ended up at the cemetery, facing the ghosts of the past. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he nodded and led her to the sitting area near the window. Maggie sat down, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes drifting to the sprawling city skyline. For a moment, she said nothing, as if collecting her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "It's time we talk about your father," she said quietly, her words hanging heavily in the air. Andrew froze, the mention of his father stirring a deep well of emotions. Anger, shame, and memories he had spent years trying to bury. "What about him?" he asked cautiously. Maggie turned to face him, her expression resolute. "I know that you've been carrying a lot of guilt for what happened to my mom. But your father, he's the one who made the decision to cut her out of the family. He's the one who destroyed her life." Andrew felt a surge of bitterness rise in his chest at the mention of his father. Victor Montgomery had been a powerful man, a towering figure who had commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He had molded Andrew into the businessman he was today, instilling in him the cold pragmatism and ambition that had propelled the Montgomery Empire to new heights. But his father had also been ruthless, unyielding when it came to protecting the family's image, even at the cost of those closest to him. "He's dead," Andrew said flatly, his voice colder than he intended. "There's nothing we can do about him now." Maggie frowned, her gaze piercing. "I know he's dead, but his legacy is still here. His decisions, the way he treated people, it's still affecting us, Andrew. And it's affecting you." Andrew bristled at her words, but deep down, he knew she was right. His father's influence still lingered, shaping the way Andrew lived his life, the way he ran his business. It was as if Victor Montgomery's shadow loomed over everything, even from beyond the grave. Maggie leaned forward, her voice firm but compassionate. "You told me you wanted to make things right. But you can't do that if you're still living under your father's shadow. You need to face what he did, and what you did under his influence." Andrew's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists. He had spent years trying to separate himself from his father's cruelty, but it had never been that simple. Victor's voice was still in his head, reminding him of the importance of power, control, and maintaining the family's untouchable image. And even now, Andrew couldn't shake the fear that he had become too much like the man he despised. "I'm not him," Andrew said quietly, more to himself than to Maggie. "I'm not like him." Maggie didn't flinch. "But you are. At least, you were. And I think part of you is still afraid that you'll never be anything else." Her words cut through him like a knife, because she had seen right through to the core of his struggle. Andrew had built his entire life around the lessons his father had taught him. Success at any cost, the family name above all else, emotions as weaknesses to be crushed. And in doing so, he had lost the parts of himself that once made him different. The parts of himself that had once cared about his family, that had loved Sarah before he turned his back on her. "How do I fix it?" Andrew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He hated how vulnerable he sounded, but he couldn't help it. He didn't know how to undo decades of damage, how to reclaim the parts of himself that had been buried under years of ambition and control. Maggie sighed, leaning back in her chair, her expression softening. "You start by acknowledging it. You can't run from what you did, or what he did. You have to face it, and then you have to choose to be different." Andrew's chest tightened. He wasn't used to this. Having someone challenge him, push him to confront the ugliest parts of himself. But Maggie was right. He couldn't make things right with her, or with anyone else, if he didn't face the darkness his father had left behind. He took a deep breath, his hands unclenching slowly. "I don't know if I can change," he admitted. "I've spent so many years being this." Maggie's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, there was a hint of empathy in her eyes. "You're already changing," she said quietly. "You've already started. Just by being here, by trying with me, that's something." Andrew looked at her, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in what felt like years. Maggie's presence had forced him to confront things he had spent years avoiding. She had cracked open the carefully constructed armor he had built around himself, exposing the man he had been too afraid to acknowledge. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "For pushing me. For not giving up on me." Maggie offered him a small, almost tentative smile. "I'm not doing this for you, Andrew. I'm doing it for me. I need to move on from all this, too. But if you're willing to try, maybe we can figure this out together." Andrew nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I'm willing," he said quietly. The days that followed were marked by a newfound determination in Andrew. He began taking small steps to distance himself from his father's legacy. Not in business, where Victor's influence had built an empire, but in the way he lived his personal life. He started by reconnecting with people he had pushed away, including old friends and estranged family members. It was awkward at first, reaching out after years of emotional distance, but with each phone call and each visit, Andrew felt a piece of himself return. Maggie noticed the change too. She saw him making the effort, not just with her, but with others as well. And though she still struggled to trust him fully, she couldn't deny that he was trying. It wasn't a perfect process. There were still moments of tension between them, moments when old wounds reopened. But now, for the first time, it felt like they were moving in the same direction. One evening, over dinner at the apartment, Maggie broke the silence that had settled between them. "What do you want your legacy to be, Andrew?" she asked suddenly, her eyes searching his. Andrew paused, the question catching him off guard. He had spent so much of his life thinking about success in terms of wealth and power, never considering what kind of mark he wanted to leave beyond that. His father's legacy had been one of fear, dominance, and control. But what did Andrew want his to be? He set down his fork, thinking for a moment before answering. "I want it to be different from his," Andrew said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "I want to leave behind something that actually matters. Something real." Maggie studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then that's what you'll do," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Andrew smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't going to be easy, transforming decades of ambition and coldness into something meaningful. But with Maggie by his side, and with a new sense of purpose guiding him, Andrew knew he was ready to take that journey. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing wealth or power. He was chasing something far more valuable. The wind was crisp as it whipped through the trees, carrying with it the scent of autumn. Leaves crunched beneath Andrew Montgomery's feet as he walked along the narrow path that led to the family estate. An estate that had once symbolized everything he was, everything he thought he had wanted. It was the place where he had grown up, where his father's influence had shaped him, and where Sarah had been cast out. But today, it was different. Today, he wasn't walking those familiar grounds as the cold, distant businessman who had followed in his father's footsteps. Today, he was someone else, someone trying to make things right. Maggie walked beside him, her arms crossed against the chill, her eyes scanning the towering mansion that loomed ahead. It had been her idea to come here, to confront the final pieces of their painful past. "If you want to let go of him," she had said, "we need to face it together." Andrew knew she was right. He had spent the last few months trying to atone, trying to distance himself from the toxic legacy his father had left behind. But this place, this house, it was the last shadow he needed to confront. They stopped at the grand iron gates. Andrew hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the latch. He hadn't been here since his father's funeral, years ago. His fingers tightened into a fist, but before he could pull away, Maggie's voice cut through his hesitation. "It's just a house, Andrew," she said softly. "It doesn't define you anymore." He looked at her, seeing the truth in her words. Maggie had become his anchor, someone who had forced him to confront the ugliness of his past but had also been there, every step of the way, as he tried to rebuild himself. And for the first time, Andrew knew what he had to do. He pushed open the gates. The path to the house seemed longer than he remembered, as if the weight of his family's history stretched out before him like a road he had to walk one last time. But with every step, Andrew felt lighter. This wasn't the same house he had left behind years ago. This wasn't the home of Victor Montgomery anymore. It was just bricks and mortar. They entered the grand foyer, its marble floors gleaming in the dim afternoon light. Andrew paused, his eyes scanning the familiar space. The ornate chandelier, the portraits of ancestors who had lived and died within these walls. His gaze lingered on one portrait in particular. His father, Victor, staring down with the same steely eyes that had once dominated his life. Maggie stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the same portrait. "He looks so different now," she murmured, her voice quiet. Andrew nodded. "I used to think he was invincible, that his way was the only way to survive in this world." He sighed, the weight of years of indoctrination finally lifting from his shoulders. But he was just a man, a flawed man who hurt people. Maggie turned to face him. "And you're not him." Andrew swallowed hard, the finality of that statement sinking in. "No, I'm not," he said, his voice resolute. "I won't be." They stood in silence for a long moment, the ghosts of the past slowly fading as the future began to take shape. Andrew had spent years trying to live up to his father's impossible expectations, but now, he realized those expectations were nothing more than chains. chains he was finally ready to break. "What do we do now?" Maggie asked, her voice soft but steady. Andrew glanced around the mansion, the walls that had once echoed with his family's pain. "We sell it," he said firmly. "All of it. I don't want this place, and I don't want anything that reminds me of him. It's time to let it go." Maggie smiled, a small but genuine smile, the first sign that maybe, just maybe, they were both ready to move on. Months passed, and Andrew's life began to change in ways he had never imagined. The mansion was sold, the last physical tie to his father severed. The money? Andrew donated it, giving back to the communities that his father had spent years ignoring, hoarding wealth while others suffered. It wasn't about redemption through charity. It was about doing something real, something meaningful. Andrew's company changed too. He implemented new policies, built a culture of empathy and respect, something his father would have sneered at. He worked to rebuild the relationships he had damaged in his relentless pursuit of success. And though it wasn't easy, every small victory felt like a step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. As for Maggie, she was still cautious around him, but the distance between them was shrinking. She had found a job working at a local nonprofit, using her experience to help others who had fallen through the cracks, just as she had. It wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling. And for the first time, Maggie felt like she was building something of her own, something that wasn't tied to the weight of her family's history. One evening, they sat together in Andrew's apartment, the city lights twinkling below them. They had started having dinner together more frequently, a quiet but significant sign that things were changing. There was still a lot unsaid between them, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a silence filled with possibility. Maggie glanced at Andrew, a thoughtful look on her face. "Do you think she'd be proud of us?" she asked quietly. Andrew's heart clenched at the mention of Sarah, but this time, the pain wasn't unbearable. He smiled, a soft, bittersweet smile. "I think she would be. I think she'd be happy to see us finally figuring it out." Maggie nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I hope so." Andrew reached across the table, placing his hand gently on hers. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But we're getting there." Maggie smiled, her grip tightening around his hand. "Yeah, we are." For the first time in years, Andrew felt at peace. He had spent so long running from his past, trying to live up to the impossible expectations of a man who had never truly understood what it meant to live. But now, he was free of that shadow. He had found something more important than wealth or power. He had found family. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. There were still moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if he could ever fully atone for the mistakes of his past. But with Maggie by his side, with their shared pain slowly turning into something stronger, Andrew knew he was finally on the right path. And as they sat there, the city alive beneath them, Andrew realized that this simple, quiet moment was what he had been searching for all along. Not redemption through wealth or power, not the validation of his father's legacy, but love, connection, family. And that, in the end, was the only legacy that mattered.